She'd been sleeping on the hallway rug for 7 nights, and on the 8th morning he found a single paw print on his kitchen tile, like a quiet apology. He noticed her because his door was never supposed to be a place for something to bow. Wait, the hallway light was always off. The building smelled of old carpet and dryer lint. Neighbors came and went with the soft shuffle of slippers and the distant rattle of pots. He had learned to keep his world tidy and small enough that grief could be folded into corners, small enough to forget to feed himself sometimes when the days felt heavy and long. It was winter in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. The city had its usual chilled air, but inside his apartment, the cold he knew was the thin one that sits on the chest, the quiet that lives under a person's breathing when there's an absence that was too big to name. He had curtains that never fully opened. He had a mug that had a chip and a photograph of a woman he visited in the very private place of his memory, where the edges blurred like an old film. He'd been alone for months, the kind of alone that becomes a habit. She, that cat, was black in the kind of color that swallowed light and made small spaces feel deeper. Not sleek, not glossy like kittens in magazines. Her fur was a map of the weather she'd survived. A tiny white freckle under one eye, a nick on an ear that looked like a folded page. Old cats show their history in places people don't always notice. They have a way of carrying the past with a soft resignation, like the way he carried his coffee thermos, useful but a little dented. He first saw her through the mail slot, a dark shape low in the corridor, head down like someone praying. She didn't look at him. She waited. The first time he opened the door, she straightened, one ear twitching, then lowered herself back to the rug as if nothing had shifted. The hallway smelled of damp cardboard and winter socks. She breathed slow, in and out. There was a little rag curled under her chin. A sock, he thought. Maybe a small swath of towel. It looked like something she had claimed he hadn't meant to watch. He was a man who kept to the margins, but grief teaches you a new kind of attention. It makes you notice the small movement of a curtain when someone passes. It makes you listen for the soft scrape of a shoe that used to be part of a rhythm. He stood in the doorway longer than he planned. The cat's pupils were like two glossy beans. She blinked once, slow. There was a patient wait in that blink, like someone choosing not to ask for help. She stayed that day, a black bowl of quiet at the edge of his light. He fetched a dish from the kitchen. He poured water without thinking. He had no food for a cat, nothing at home but a half box of cereal and a jar of pickles. He left the dish on the floor as an offering. The apartment hummed with the low sound of the refrigerator and the memory of a radio that wasn't there anymore. When he returned, the water was untouched, but she'd edged closer, the way someone inches toward a warm cup, and touched the rim with a whisker. The small things became a geography. The carpet had a faded line where someone's feet had worn it into a path. The cat made a new line. She slept curled at the foot of his door each night. He would lie awake, feel the side of the bed cool, and then hear the soft thump of her settling on the rug. Sometimes she would move in the night, her paws making a hush on the floor. In the morning there would be a small crescent of light where her back had been, as if she carried moonlight in the curve of her spine. He was not the kind of man who told people he couldn't sleep. He told fewer things than that. But he began to watch the door, like someone keeping vigil at the edge of a hospital ward. He made coffee stronger than he needed. He warmed a plate of fish he'd bought because there was a sign in a shop window about the sea and the way it smelled. He placed the plate near the hallway, and the cat came like a secret. She ate with the kind of care that suggests one has not always known the regularity of a bowl. She was older. He could tell by the way her spine curved, by the slow, deliberate stretch when she rose. Old cats have an economy of movement, everything conservative. She would come to the threshold, stop, and look at him, then move one step in, then stop again. There was always a pause, an assessment. He felt like a person being measured for a suit. He learned the inside of her patience, neighborhoods, form, a kind of history in the things that are left behind. There were traces around him of other lives, a paper cup crushed in the gutter, a child's toy with a missing wheel, a photograph leaning against the baseboard of a vacant apartment. The cat had her own traces. Sometimes she carried a scrap of thread. Once he found a small feather by his shoe. She left it on the rug like a postcard. He would pick it up, turn it over in his fingers, and the feather smelled faintly of other places. He tried not to let hope arrive like a visitor before its time, but little things kept arriving. It wasn't immediate trust. Trust in animals or people is something built between breaths. The cat had times of fierce independence. She would be gone by morning, as if she had never been found. He would hurry to the corridor, throw open the door, call a soft hello into the stairwell, and hear only the echo of his own voice. Then, later in the afternoon, she'd be there again, waiting as if the world had not shifted. Once, 2 evenings in a row, she didn't show for days. He worried in a way he had not expected. He found himself imagining scenarios that tightened. His chest, a fight, a new home, a human who chased her away. Grief makes the mind a little more vivid with its fears. He watched how she slept with half an ear up, alert even in rest. He learned the tiny rituals that made her feel safe. A hand on the floor, palm flat. Let him measure the space between them. He would extend his fingers and she would press the side of her cheek against his knuckle like a seal answering the tide. When she did that, something in him loosened. It was a small currency. Headbutts. The slow purr that starts like a motor and settles under limbs. The first time she allowed her belly to show, he felt an almost unbearable lightness. Like the weight of his chest had been lifted by a thread. Days arranged themselves around the ritual. He would wake, feel the emptiness, and then the rug would answer. The small presence of her became a calendar marker. He bought a cheap throw blanket and left it folded near the door. One morning he found the blanket where she liked to lay, a little frayed where her claws had tangled. He started to leave a window cracked a bit so the corridor of air would be warm. He placed familiar things where she had found them. An old towel like a patch of home, a tin of cat food with rust at the lid. His life grew a margin, a place set aside for a creature who hadn't asked for much. People in the building noticed, him in new ways. The woman downstairs started to nod when she saw him in the stairwell. The old man with the thick glasses left a bowl once on the landing. A neighbor stopped to ask if the cat belonged to him. He said no, and watched his voice fold around the small lie. It wasn't his to claim, not yet. But when the neighbor nodded and smiled, it felt like an offer being made and accepted. The building had a softness that surfaced slowly when someone or something fragile arrived. There were nights when the city sounded bigger than usual, sirens stitched through the distance. Laughter spilled from an upstairs party and died in the winter air. He would sit on the small couch and watch the doorway, and the cat would be a dark punctuation on the rug. She would tilt her head like a question. He learned to respond without words. He would hum under his breath. She would turn her ears. The cadence of two beings learning the same language, without grammar, without rules. She had a way of staring at the window, as if a memory waited there. Once he followed her gaze and saw only reflected street lamps. He could imagine she was seeing the outline of a life elsewhere, the place where a human's hands had once been familiar. There is a peculiar ache when you watch an animal remember, a human you no longer can. It's as if memory itself is a bridge that gives out sometimes, and you stand on the bank hoping someone else will build the next span. He carried small rituals that were not for show. He would fold his laundry with careful hands. He drank his coffee black the way the woman in his photograph had liked it years before. He kept the radio low because he believed there is sanctity in a low sound. The cat, however, rearranged his interior in the smallest of ways. She would stretch and leave a fur line on his pillow. She would sleep near the soft thud of his breath and, in the morning, move like a tide that had been triggered by some internal moon. She marked spots with the softness of her steps. People often think of rescue as a dramatic haul, a sudden clifftop save. This was not like that. She wasn't a kitten that could be scooped up and transformed. She was an old animal with knotted years. There were moments he imagined giving up. He would watch her walk away and the space inside him would close like a fist. Don't go, he would think. which is the most human of all private prayers. He began leaving the door ajar in the evenings. Once he left it a crack, and she came inside just enough to let her nose explore the living room carpet, then retreated as if testing the climate of a household. The crack of the door became a promise he wasn't sure he had the right to make. There were small social rituals that mattered more than he expected. One afternoon, a child passing by the door dropped a paper plane. It fluttered and landed at her feet. She batted it once, then nudged it toward him as if presenting a gift. He laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. The cat watched him with the long, inscrutable look of someone witnessing a sunrise for the second time. He realized then how hungry he had been for laughter that belonged only to the present. He started to talk to her softly, the way one speaks to a plant you're nursing. "You're hungry?" he would ask, or "You cold?" The first time she answered with a low, amused sound, he felt a small, foolish joy. He thought of names and then thought better of naming her too quickly. Names can do work. They can bind. He waited, letting whatever this was find its own title. At night he kept a lamp on low by the sofa. He read old letters, the edges yellowed, and she lay curled on his slippers. He watched the motion of her breathing as if in it were a Morse code of constancy. There was something about having another heartbeat in the apartment that made the absence feel less like an accusation. The silence softened around the edges. A neighbor once left her a small blanket. It smelled faintly of lavender. The cat accepted it like a treaty. She slept on it with the careful dignity of someone who had earned a small piece of comfort. When he saw that blanket, he understood how communities can be accidental caretakers, how kindness is often given in cheap things because it has to be. He found himself paying attention to the people who slipped into the margins of his life. He began to nod back when someone greeted him on the stair. The cat showed him unusual trust in small ways. One evening she let him pet her along the back. His hand shook a little. It felt like touching a fragile old coin. The cat leaned into the stroke as if accepting the transfer of warmth. He had kept himself closed off for a long time, thinking that solitude would be easier. Instead, this presence made him realize the work of keeping a life open. It required small, patient efforts. The cat offered no grand affection. She gave fractions of herself, like pocket change, and he found he could buy whole afternoons. He tried to keep a log in his head of the days she stayed and the days she vanished. Sometimes she left for 3, 4 nights. He would worry, make a cup of tea, and leave it by the door like a beacon. Once he found a small smear of dirt on his mat and knew she had come back. The smear was nothing and everything. He would trace it with his finger. The act of tracing became ritualized. He would count breaths and feel lighter by a single number at a time. It was not the thunderclap of rescue stories, but the slow, steady accumulation of minutes that add up to a life. On the 8th morning, when he found the paw print on his tile, he sat down on the floor in a way he hadn't expected. The print was imperfect. 3 toe pads, a slight drag mark. It was the kind of thing people write poems about, he thought, and then felt silly for that thought. He wiped it with his sleeve, and the fabric came away dirtier than before. He laughed at himself and at his own surprise, and the laugh fell into the apartment like a small bell. There was a tiny seed of something in the way she looked at him after that, an alteration so small that he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. The cat looked at him with something new in her eyes, not exactly trust, not exactly surrender, but recognition. It was like the moment when you realize a melody has a meaning you hadn't noticed. The world slid a hair to the left. He did not know what would come. He only knew, with the quiet certainty that settles in the chest when you are beginning something, that something had begun. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. He began to count the mornings she stayed, not with numbers written in a notebook, not with any ceremony. He counted with small gestures, an extra scoop of his coffee, the way the light hit the hallway rug, the tiny rustle when the mail slipped through the slot and she lifted her head as if expecting a letter. Days gathered like shells along a shoreline. Each one had a shape. Each one had a sound. The winter that lived inside the building eased into something like habit. The radiator hissed in the evening, a tired breath. The air tasted of detergent and boiled cabbage from the apartments below. Sometimes the smell of a neighbor's frying onions crept in through the doorframe and wrapped the hallway in the kind of ordinary warmth that could be clumsy and beautiful at once. She moved through that atmosphere like she owned a private map. There were routes she preferred. The landing outside the elevator was a place she seldom visited. The shadow by the cleaning supply closet was a place she avoided. She had somehow learned a topography of fear and comfort in the building that nobody else knew. In the beginning, their exchanges were arithmetic. One action, one response. He would open the door. She would breathe. He would put down food. She would eat. He would sit on the couch and read a sentence or two, and she would be a black comma at the threshold. The behaviors were small, reliable, and reverent. But then small things changed. Habit shifted into ritual, and ritual into a kind of language she answered to sound, not always his voice. Sometimes it was the rustle of tissue paper or the clink of the spoon in the cup. Once the squeak of his old refrigerator door was enough. He learned to make noises as if he were composing. A soft hum when he walked in. The loose jingle of his keys. The careful scrape of a chair leg across tile. Each became a sentence in the grammar they were inventing together. She blinked at him a lot. Slow blinks. The kind of blink that feels like a promise. People underestimate the meaning of a cat's slow blink. It is a departure from the animal's instinct to be watchful. It is the animal's way of saying, in the smallest form, I will take the risk of being vulnerable with you. He started to respond in turn. He would look at her and blink back deliberately, like a child learning to say hello. It felt ridiculous the first few times. Ridiculous and sacred in equal parts. There were evenings when he noticed how she sat on the rug with her paws tucked like a folded letter. Her ears would flicker with the noises of the stairwell. Her tail would make a faint, methodical sweep. Across the floor, a metronome of contentment. He sat across from her and pretended not to be studying the subtleties of her breathing. He pretended not to catalog the exact angle of her whiskers, how one whisker was slightly shorter than the others as if clipped by some past bother. Pretending lasted for about 10 minutes. Then he would reach out his hand and place it flat on the floor. She would smell it. Sometimes she would touch his finger with the tip of her nose. Sometimes she would, without fuss, press the side of her head into his knuckle. A gentle but irrevocable pact. The little rituals formed armor around the old grief he'd been carrying. He wouldn't say he was healed. He would not pretend the ache had gone. But he found there were spaces of the day now that felt gentler. The apartment registered differently. He noticed the way sunlight pooled in the late afternoon along the windowsill, and how she would find that pool of light and rearrange herself like someone reclaiming a warmed bench. The cat had an economy of motion. No wasted steps, no grand gestures. Her affection was not flashy. It was the slow accumulation of small things. Weekends became exercises in attentiveness. He learned when she preferred certain noises. A soft radio played the way it had always played in the corner of his life. Faint, unobtrusive, mostly spoken word shows. On Sundays, he would bring leftovers from a small market down the street. A sliver of fish, a smear of mashed potato. He would leave the plate and watch from the sofa. She would come forward in the exact sequence of steps she had settled into. First a sniff, an assessment, a cautious nibble, then the relaxed consumption of someone accepting regularity. She moved like someone who had been given something precious and was making sure it lasted. At night, she slept by the doorway. Sometimes he would wake and find her gone, as if she had never been there. Other times she would be sprawled weirdly, all belly and trust, and he would hesitate before making a move, unsure whether he was allowed to break the spell. Once, when he reached to stroke her back, she lifted her head and closed her eyes. She made a sound that was not quite a purr, not quite a sigh. It settled into the small hollow inside of him and stayed there. There were days, long afternoons, when the cat stood at the edge of the building's stairwell. He would see her silhouette framed in the narrow light that fell from the skylight. She would stand absolutely still, as if listening to something, beyond the building's outer skin. He once followed her silently down 3 flights. He kept his distance like someone trying to be careful with a sleeping bird. She led him to a small patch behind a potted plant where there were tufts of a blanket, the kind someone might have left behind during a move. She moved there and curled, and he felt absurdly protective. He wanted to lay down beside her, to be the small human blanket she had found. Sometimes she disappeared, for a day, for 3 days. The vanishing became an ache on its own. He would count the nights and feel lighter when a paw appeared at the crack of the door. He would leave the window ajar and sometimes, on colder mornings, find a smear of dirt, where her fur had brushed the sill. People asked why he worried so much. To them it was a cat wandering. To him it was a person walking out of his life and then coming back to stay. That difference was where his own history made the present heavy. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? He asked himself that question in the quiet moments because he wanted to understand the shape of his gratitude. The question helped him locate the exact place inside him that unclenched when she was present. He would pose it like a soft confession, sometimes speaking it aloud to the cat. She would not answer in words. She answered in constancy. Neighbors took notice. Noticing is a small social currency in buildings where people come and go with folded lives. The woman from the 3rd floor, who baked bread that smelled like the coast, started to leave a bowl on the landing with a note. For the black cat. The old man with the spectacles began to tell him stories about cats he'd known when he was young, cats that would sit on windowsills like sentinels. Those stories felt less like entertainment and more like an act of shared memory. People softened when they saw the pair together. A man with a coat buttoned too high, and a black animal that belonged to no one and to everyone at once. There was a day when the building's superintendent, who seldom spoke and usually fixed things without being asked, stopped in the hall and watched the cat for a long time. He said simply, "She knows where the warmth is." It was not a pronouncement. It was recognition. The superintendent had seen many things, but he had not seen this kind of patient waiting very often. He shrugged as if to say the world offers soft things sometimes, and they are worth the small observation of a human heart. The cat's habits grew specific. She would wait at the same corner when the morning took on the particular clarity of frost. Her paws would leave tiny imprints on the dusty mat. He learned which step of the day made her nervous. The arrival of the courier, the slamming of a yao, door above when someone carried groceries. In those moments she would flatten, ears turned backward, and he would soften his own movements so she could calibrate to his calm. The bond became a dialect of reassurance. There were little gifts, not often. But when they appeared, they were heavy with meaning. A feather, a scrap of yarn, a flattened plastic wrapper. He kept them in a shoebox under his bed, treating them like relics. Once she left something by his slipper, a small, bedraggled mouse already gone limp, placed with the kind of pride that only an animal can have when it gives you survival as a present. He felt a wave of something complicated. Gratitude, and the shadow of the life she had led before him. He set the mouse outside on the stair landing and whispered a thank you in the tone people use for ephemeral miracles. He started to change, small behaviors. He stopped shutting the hall door all the way. He warmed his hands before reaching for the brass knob because it seemed like a courtesy to the cold that often made her hesitate. He left the blanket on the floor, folded just so. He found himself checking his phone more slowly, like a man reluctant to drop the present of a quiet minute. He noticed the kind of shoes he wore becoming less important than the kind of pause he could make at the end of a day. The cat, in her patient way, rearranged the scaffolding of his time. He began to speak differently to people. Where once he had been curt, someone who kept sentences short and private, he found himself telling the woman downstairs about how she would curl like a crescent moon at the threshold. He found himself admitting that he had been lonely. He expected the world to offer advice or pity. Instead, people leaned in with small attentions. A plate of soup pushed through a doorway, a bowl left at the landing, a gentle, practical question about whether he needed a hand. The cat had opened something in him that allowed him to take tiny help without feeling diminished. There were days when the cat fed his losses back to him in impossible little acts. He would be thinking about the woman in the photograph, the one who lived in the place of his memory, with edges that blurred. He would be sitting in his armchair and the cat would come and press her head against his wrist. It was a domestic punctuation, a soft punctuation that read as a sentence that said, "You are not alone right now." The gesture held no grand theology. It held only a present tense reassurance. The simplest contact was the most radical. He learned the deep grammar of cat trust. It is patient, it is cautious, it doesn't arrive in a single flowering moment. It grows like a plant in cracked concrete, tenacious, small, and unwilling to be spectacular. There was a sequence to it in the cat's case. First, the allowance of presence. She would stretch on the rug and not flinch when he walked by. Then came the inspection of his hands, followed by the acceptance of light touches along the back. A paw on his shoe. The presentation of her belly, not always extended but offered in precarious moments when she decided he was safe. She showed him how to be accepted incrementally. He noticed an easing in himself. Where grief had been a tight knot that clenched and refused motion, he found small openings. He would walk to the window, and, instead of his chest feeling like an anchor, it would be a small buoy. The cat's rhythm, simple, deliberate, finite, gave him permission to set aside larger anxieties and attend to a smaller beat. The compulsion to fix everything did not vanish. It receded like the tide. He learned that presence can act as a balm even when nothing is fixed. The city brought its noises into this small life, and they were not all cruel. A band playing down the block sounded like celebration. A child's cry sent the cat to the threshold, with an alertness that made him smile in a way that felt foreign and good. He saved a few ounces of laughter for moments like that. Laughter had been rare. The cat made it plentiful again. Sometimes in the early morning, the corridor would be so quiet it felt like a held breath. He would watch her, and she would be a living shadow. He became aware of his own shadow beside hers. It was absurd, and he welcomed the absurdity. There is a peculiar closeness in feeling like two beings are sharing the edge of a day. It is not a fusion. It is a nearness that allows for independent lives but with fingers that sometimes brush. She had rituals of her own that asked him to respond in ways he had never anticipated. Once she woke him at dawn by pawing a book he had left by the couch, nudging it until it fell open so the page was exposed to daylight. He took it as an odd request and read the sentence she had nudged him to, and it was a short paragraph about the necessity of small joys. He could have laughed at the coincidence, but he felt watched over by something intentional and odd and grateful. Neighbors started to leave notes. One had a small sketch of the cat and the words, "She has a kind paws." Another had offered tips on food. Somebody left a small knitted collar on the landing. He laughed when he saw it. It was too small. The cat inspected it with suspicion and then dignity, like a queen assessing a jewel. She did not accept it, but she did not dismiss the kindness. The building, small as it was, had pooled its affections around this creature and, in doing so, had managed to knit the lives of people into a softer fabric. The man found himself composing names in his head. He tried them on like hats. He found some that sounded too whimsical, others too formal. He resisted naming because he worried that a name could force the shape of something that wanted to remain free. Names can hold expectations. Instead, he used qualities, the quiet one, the steady one, the black one. Each label felt clumsy. He left the naming to a later time because the cat did not need a name yet. Or rather, he felt not ready to assign one. There were particular gestures that revealed more than words could. Once, after a heavy day of thinking, he sat on the floor and let his knees buckle. The apartment felt too large. The photograph on the table seemed to speak in a smaller voice than before. He felt small and old and exhausted. From the doorway, the cat padded in and climbed into his lap with an ease that surprised him. Her weight was moderate, comforting. She pressed into him and fell asleep with a sound like a small motor. He wept, without making those tears loud. They were private, salt as any. She did not stir. She stayed. That moment was a hinge. He realized he had kept himself from being held for too long. Her ability to be present without comment became a kind of lesson. He began to imagine futures in tiny increments. Not grand trajectories, not sweeping plans, a week of eggs from the market, a book to finish, a heater check before the cold came back. The cat's steadiness allowed him to see how small structures could hold. He began to think about the possibility of someone else entering the apartment, and his anxiety shifted. The idea of making room for another person was no longer met with terror but with a cautious curiosity. The world had expanded, not in huge leaps, but in the gentle unfolding one sees when a curtain is pulled and the sunlight comes in. There were gifts he could not name, not material. The habitat of his thinking changed. He found the edges of his memories becoming less jagged. He laughed at jokes he used to find flat. He noticed that he had a rhythm to his breathing that matched the cat's purrs at times. There was a smoothing. The cat, with her patient insistence on being part of the day, taught him how to be. He practiced gentleness the way one practices a piece of music, daily, imperfect, and with steady repetition. And then, after weeks that folded into each other like pages of a well-worn book, there was a small shift that felt like arrival. It wasn't an event. It was a sequence of small agreements. He left the door open on a rainy afternoon, not intentionally, but because it was near him and the kettle was on. And when he turned to find her, she had walked into the living room entirely. She crossed the threshold with her tail high, an act that had before been hesitant. She stopped in the center of the room, looked around, and then walked straight to the armchair. Without ceremony, she leapt up beside him and curled. She made the choice to be inside the apartment, not merely on its fringes. He did not burst into tears. He sat very still. The machinery of feeling is often quieter than you imagine. He reached for her slowly, not to test her, but to thank her for trusting him with the small, everyday stages of her life. She let him touch the crown of her head. For the first time, she did not flinch. She leaned into the touch. It was a small, decisive movement, like a single page turning in a long book. That was the breakthrough. It was not a dramatic rescue. It was not a proclamation. It was a quiet, mutual agreement to share the same light for a while. She had, in her slow way, decided he was safe enough. He had, in his slow way, decided she was worth staying for. The hall became less of a border and more of a seam. They learned the contours of domesticity together. The place to curl, the spot where the sun warmed the rug, the cadence of passing strangers. The cat's presence stitched a new seam into his days. He would later think about how tenderness grows from small decisions. He would think about the generosity of daily acts. He would remember the day she crossed fully into the apartment as the point where the weight in his chest uncoiled just enough for him to breathe differently. It was not salvation. It was consolation. It was not a cure. It was a companion that taught him how to carry his grief with open hands. At night, after the breakthrough, she slept on the armchair and sometimes in the crook of his knees. He made a habit of recording the small victories of the week in his mind. He counted the number of times she let him brush her. He counted the number of mornings she greeted him at the door. He counted the nights she stayed. Counting replaced anxious wandering. He left himself room to notice the small, luminous increments of life. He still worried, not because she might leave, though that fear lurked like a small animal in the corner of his mind. He worried because the world was unpredictable and the animal was old. But those worries were not tyrannical. They were manageable. There were steps to take. There were neighbors who would help. There were bowls to refill. There were vet appointments to consider if that became necessary. He learned to be practical, without being brittle. He learned to hold plans who carried soft edges. One evening, when winter threatened to return, he sat with his hand on the arm of the chair and watched her sleep. The streetlight outside made patterns on her back. He thought of the many nights that had come before, some heavy, some quiet. He thought about the way the world keeps offering small mercies. He felt grateful in a way that was steady, not revelatory, but true. The breakthrough was both a tiny miracle and a gentle obligation. He understood that loving her meant tending these small things: warmth, food, attention, and freedom. The bond they had formed was not a storybook solution. It was a human, scale kind of thing, modest, stubborn, real. He returned to his days with this new architecture of care. He discovered that the presence of another being allowed him to move through the days with less autopilot. He felt a freshness in the small hours. The cat allowed him to invest attention without grand stakes. She taught him how to be patient, and in being patient he found a reservoir of soft resilience. The little trust she gave him was a hinge on which a large part of his world turned. It was in itself a kind of rescue, not from some dramatic danger, but from the slow attrition of solitude. She did not fix the past. She rearranged his relationship with it. She asked nothing in the way that matters. No promises, no absolutes. She offered presence, and presence did a work that had little to do with spectacle and everything to do with being. As days continued to weave into each other, the rituals deepened. He learned that she liked the afternoon sunlight on the windowsill, and that she disliked the metallic ring the elevator made when the doors closed. He learned she preferred his right hand in the mornings, and that she had a tiny ritual of pawing the rug 3 times before settling down, as if smoothing out the future. These were the fragments that built up into a life, and in those fragments the breakthrough held firm. She trusted him. He trusted her. They had arrived at a small, steady intimacy. It looked to any casual observer like a man and a cat sharing an apartment. To him, it felt like the beginning of a way of being that would change how he moved through the rest of his days. The small miracle of a creature choosing him was an oath he did not speak out loud. It was held instead in the way he folded a blanket, in the way he warmed his hands before touching the brass knob, in the way he let his words fall softer when he read. He began to notice the small evidences of another life that threaded through hers. At first they were so slight he could have missed them: a crumb of thread on the mat, a soft smear of dust on his shoe that hadn't been there the night before, a strip of paper, as thin as a thought, tucked under the lip of the stair landing. Each thing was a quiet punctuation that suggested she belonged to more than his doorway. He told himself not to invent stories, to avoid making fables out of scraps. Yet the human habit of meaning-making is relentless. He found himself arranging explanations like a careful gardener. Perhaps she was scavenging through neighboring yards, perhaps she was visiting other doors for warmth, perhaps she had a small, secret household somewhere in the city that he, with his tidy routines, had never noticed. The objects she left became a grammar. Feathers arrived on Thursdays. A thread, dark as night, on Sundays. A small, flattened cap, likely fallen from some child's toy, entombed in the curve of the mat once, placed there with an intent that felt like ceremony. The cat did not leave these things casually. She placed them precisely. He started a box under his bed and set the things there as if they were relics. Sometimes, late at night, he would open the box and lay the gifts on his palm, turning them over like a reader re-examining the margins of a book. Each fragment felt like an argument. I have a past, and it intersects with yours in ways you cannot yet see. She had habits that suggested a life beyond his threshold. There were nights she ignored his soft humming, nights when his radio sang low and the apartment smelled of baking bread from below, and she would not come. He learned to accept her absences with a small, stoic breath, but he also collected clues. One morning he found a faint smear of paint on her whisker, pale, almost accidental. He imagined a child with a watercolor set, painting the world in secret. It was a small, tender fantasy. He kept it, though he had no proof. The pattern intensified. The cat began to bring more complex things: a small piece of ribbon tied in what looked like a knot, a metal washer gleaming despite a film of dust, a tiny corroded coin with unfamiliar markings. When she presented these items, she would sit, very straight, tail wrapped like a ribbon, and look at him with an expression that read like pride. She seemed to say, in the assured language of animals, "Look what I have found." He began to feel watched over by an intelligence that was not asking for permission to exist outside his understanding. One evening he found something that stopped him cold. It was not on the mat. It lay under the stairwell light, tucked beside the baseboard like a thing left on purpose. A small, enamel tag, the kind that might hang from a collar. It was not ornate. It had been worn by weather. The letters were partly rubbed away, but he could still make out two initials. He looked at it until the letters blurred. He considered leaving it where it lay, like an offering he was afraid to touch. Instead, he picked it up with the gentleness one affords a sleeping bird and carried it inside, where its cold surface warmed under his palm. He did not know why that tag unsettled him more than the other objects. Maybe because it suggested ownership, and the idea of ownership made his chest tighten. The tag implied a home somewhere, a human who had perhaps recently tended this animal before she found him. His first instinct was to be jealous. He chastised himself for feeling possessive over a creature who had never been his. Jealousy was childish, he thought, but the impression persisted. This object hinted at a history with other hands. That night, the cat slept on the armchair, chin tucked to paw, breathing a small, steady breath. He sat across from her and thought of all the ways animals become bridges between humans. He thought of the woman in the photograph and the things in his apartment that had once been shared. He wondered whether the cat's own history included ruins he had not yet entered. He imagined a person who had lost track of time, who had mislaid a life in pieces. He considered the possibility the tag belonged to someone who had tried and failed to keep her long ago. The thought made him ache like a bruise. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? The question hovered like steam above a kettle. He asked it sometimes out loud. He asked it in the morning when the light came soft and the apartment felt like an instrument that had been tuned. He asked it when he lay awake and wondered whether the small way she placed cotton on the mat was an act of sympathy. He had never liked the category of knowing that humans assign to animals. It implies a moral calculus that isn't always there. But sometimes, in the rare quiet that comes when the city is reduced to an undercurrent and two beings share a stillness, it felt like she did know something. Not the details of sorrow, not the precise architecture of memory, but the contour of steadiness, the edges of need. The human habit of projecting sentiment onto another being is a blunt tool, but it often finds a truth. The morning after he found the enamel tag, she disappeared for 2 nights. He became a person who checked the stairwell at odd hours. He left, a bowl with food and a note written in a hurried hand that said, "If you belong somewhere, there's food here, it's safe." He did not intend to sound so clumsy. He was trying to express the simplest things, and failed. When she returned the 3rd evening, she moved with the same careful deliberation as always, but there was a faint limp in her step. It was almost imperceptible. He hunched forward without meaning to, as if to catch her, to test the fracture, in his own imagination. He grew anxious in the shape of a small animal. He noticed his breath catch when she lifted her paw and moved. He started watching the direction she took when she left. Initially, it seemed random, down the stairwell, to the adjacent door across the landing. But patterns became visible like traces on a map. She tended to go toward the older apartments, the ones with curtains that never fully opened, the ones that smelled of wood and old songbooks. She spent time near a unit where the door always had music leaking out, a steady 2-chord guitar, and a voice that hummed with the kind of tenderness you hear in a lullaby. Once, in the late afternoon light, he saw her sitting by that door as if listening. The person inside paused, came to the door, and opened it a sliver. A shadow leaned out and spoke softly. The cat watched them with an absence of fear that felt like a key. He began to follow her sometimes at a distance. He did not want to be the kind of man who stalked an animal's life. Yet curiosity pulled like a tide. He would wait at the stair landing and watch her slip through shadows, down past the old man's door and toward the garden courtyard at the back of the building. The courtyard was a place of small miracles, an overgrown rose bush, a bench that had once been painted green, a stray newspaper that sometimes sheltered a small warbler. The cat loved that place. He watched her slip between the roots of the rose bush and vanish. The courtyard offered the sense that the world might be composed of hidden rooms. The cat seemed to know their doors. When he followed her into the courtyard, one evening, he found her sitting on the back step of a door he had never seen open before. The door was slightly ajar and warm as an idea. He could hear the faint clink of dishes inside. He stayed far enough away to be invisible, but near enough that the heat of human habitation brushed his cheeks. The cat sat by the threshold and stretched, then darted forward, as if invited. He heard a woman laugh, a sound like water poured into a dry bowl. It made him stumble inside his own chest. He considered knocking, or calling out, but he did not. He was an intruder by proximity, and did not want to violate the fragile privacy of whatever domestic life waited on the other side. He watched as the woman, no more than 30, hair in a loose knot, bent and stroked the cat. The cat closed her eyes and leaned into the hand. The woman spoke in a soft voice. He could not make out the words, but the tone was an unfamiliar tenderness, like someone tenderly speaking to a photograph. The man wanted to be brave and introduce himself in the story of the enamel tag, but instead he retreated into shadow and carried the sight with him like punctuation. The next morning the cat arrived with a small scrap of fabric that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon. She sat it at his slipper as if to say, "I have found something you might like." He smelled it until the scent felt like a small map of the previous evening. The world was giving him clues. Each clue was a whisper, and he had to lean close to hear. Then at the edge of 1 week, the pattern shifted. She started to disappear not for hours but entire days. He would leave in the morning and return to find her absent. The bowl he left would sit uneaten. When she returned, she brought less, a plastic wrapper here, a crumpled paper there, but more often she came back with an expression that was slightly guarded. She lingered longer in the shadows. She scanned the corridor with a look that had become keen, as if she had been conditioned not only by kindness, but by some cautionary event. The soft brightness that had begun to color their routines dimmed a little. One night he heard a disturbance in the hallway. It was not loud. It was the kind of human sound that is folded with small frustration. A raised voice, sharp, then softer, and the thudding of someone moving heavily. He opened his door a sliver and saw two silhouettes, a tall man with shoulders like a gate, and the same woman from the courtyard, her brow furrowed, hands fluttering in a gesture he could not name. The tall man was anger, held too easily. The woman was the kind of person who responds to the world with gentle correction. The cat sat between them, a small black punctuation that didn't seem to know which side to pick. Words passed in clipped exchange. The man said something the cat's ears picked up and flattened at. Then he left with a final slam that echoed down 3 floors. The woman entered the door and looked after him with a face that invited neither pity nor rescue. It held the firmness of someone who had learned how to navigate tenderness within chaos. The cat followed her inside with a careful step, then returned to his door and sat on the mat like a guard. He wanted to run. Inside, into the gap of story that had been revealed. He wanted to know her name. He wanted to find the tag's origin. But he remained on his side of the threshold, watching. After that night, the cat's outings became shorter and more anxious. She would come back with her fur slightly bristled, ears peaked, whiskers streaked with the dust of the stairwell. She had never been afraid of other humans the way he saw fear now. It was a different kind of knowledge, a memory of something that made her quicken her gait and prefer corners. He found himself wanting to be a protector the way a neighbor might, be small and practical. He left a second bowl of water on the landing and tucked a note under the lid. "If you need a break, there's room here." The note felt foolishly human, but he placed it like a lifeline. The woman from the courtyard started to knock at his door, and their voices met like the blending of 2 slow melodies. She had a name that was soft when spoken. Lena. She told him in fragments about the cat's pattern. "She comes and goes," she said, "and sometimes she disappears for days. I think she has choices." Her eyes held an unfinished sentence. She mentioned a neighbor above who played guitar, an old man who fed her from time to time, and a stray that sometimes followed her home. She spoke as if the cat threaded several lives together, and the man felt pride flaring briefly at the idea that he had a part in this web. There was a difference, too, something like a fissure that crackled at the edges. Lena told him once over tea that the cat belonged to many people, and to no one in particular. She picks her places, she said. She likes heat and soft, voices and places where people remember to leave a towel. Her description felt right, an animal who negotiated tenderness through geography. He wondered who had first placed the enamel tag on a collar. He imagined a child with sticky fingers and a mother's careful voice, and the possibility of a home that had once held her. As the days shortened and the cold threaded into the bones of late autumn, the cat's gifts grew more curious. One morning he found, placed on his mat like an offering, a small rectangle of paper folded with the care of something that wanted a secret kept. It was not in a child's hand. It had sharper edges, as if cut and kept. He unfolded it and found a thin sketch, a door in the courtyard, a potted plant, and a margin with a tiny heart. He traced the lines with his finger until they blurred. The drawing felt amateur and earnest. He placed it in the shoebox beside the other relics, and the catalogue of curiosities deepened. The cat's disappearances began to coalesce into a pattern, mostly afternoons, sometimes late nights. He started timing his own comings and goings, around the possibility of seeing her enter certain doors. He wanted to observe without intruding. He learned how to be a patient detective. Small steps, quiet breath, few assumptions. He would watch her leave his mat and track her to the courtyard, then wait as she slipped into a narrow door that led down a brick alley. Once, he followed that alley until it opened into a small, dilapidated shed where, through the slats, he glimpsed a cluster of animals, cats of various sizes, and realized he had stumbled into a kind of informal refuge. Someone under the city's skin was tending to animals with the care of a lover and the secrecy of someone who feared city regulations. He did not enter. He only watched from the margin, feeling like a voyeur to an unscripted sanctuary. Then came the night that changed the pattern in a way that startled the marrow. It was late and rain had come like a curtain. He had been reading, and the lamp threw a warm circle on the page. The apartment smelled of boiled soup and the small, faithful hum of a refrigerator. He heard the cat at the door, a quiet, urgent sound. He went out and found her soaked, the fur heavy and dark, eyes luminous with a distress he had not seen before. She limped more pronouncedly now, a small hitch that made him want to kneel down. He lifted her gently. She did not struggle. She pressed her warm body into his chest as if lodging a message there. There was mud along the lower edge of her belly, and a thin line of something crusted near her flank. His heart beat in a rhythm too close to alarm. He bundled her in a towel and carried her inside. He boiled water and wetted a cloth. He examined the crust with a practiced hand, not because he was an expert, but because care can be improvised. The wound was a superficial scrape, but it smelled faintly of old iron and street dust, unsanitary. He cleaned it with patient, careful strokes. As he worked, he had the impression of a life lived in margins, of a creature who threaded many households and returned with signs of skirmish. She slept soundly that night, curled in the crook of his arm. He stayed awake watching the shallow rise and fall of her breath. When morning came, she was gone. He went to the mat and found, in the same place where she usually left a gift, a single damp letter. It had been folded as if obeying a habit. The page held a single line in a hand that was not Lena's. "Meet me at midnight." There was no signature, only a small drawing of a key. He held the paper like someone holding a fuse. Questions bundled into each other. Who had written it? Was it for him? For the cat? For Lena? The admonition to meet at midnight felt loaded with possibility and danger. He felt a quick animal surge of worry, not only for the cat but for the architecture of the small world they had made. Midnight is a thin place between days. It is when the city exhales and secrets step forward. He thought about showing Lena. He thought about doing nothing. He paced the small lines of his apartment and tried to tame his imagination. He told himself that the paper might mean nothing, It might be a joke. It might be nothing at all. But when he stepped into the hallway that evening and saw the cat waiting, eyes glinting like small dark coins, he felt the pattern sharpen into a path. She brushed against his shoe and then walked toward the courtyard, as if leading him to an unannounced chapter. He tried to sleep that night and failed. He thought of the enamel tag, of the scratch on her flank, of the woman's laugh in the courtyard, of the tall man's anger. He thought of all the small hands that had passed over the cat's back and wondered how many of them had been kind enough and how many had not. He wrestled with the idea that maybe he had been living a fraction of somebody else's life with the cat as a common thread, and that thread was now calling him to follow. When midnight approached, he found himself at the landing, the paper folded in his pocket like a promise he did not quite trust. The courtyard was awash of silver under the streetlight. The rosebush was a blurred silhouette. He could make out the outline of the same narrow door that had opened for Lena. He waited with the kind of breathless caution a child has when listening for a story. Then, through the hush, he saw movement. A shadow crossing the courtyard, deliberate and unhurried. It was the cat. She walked with the surety of someone born to this rhythm. He followed without sound, each step measured. The narrow door opened just enough to let her slip through. For the first time since he had started watching, an internal rule governed him. Do not make noise, do not reveal. He felt like a thief and a guardian at once. He pressed himself against the brick and saw, through the small gap, the outline of a room lit by a single lamp. There were beds, simple narrow things, and cages that held kittens and blankets stacked like small hills. A woman he had not seen before sat at a table with a cup of something steaming. She looked up, and their eyes met with the frankness of strangers who might have been neighbors for years. She smiled like someone acknowledging a shared faith. The cat crossed the room and jumped into her lap with the sort of joy that made the man ache. He planned to retreat. He decided he should not invade. He should walk away with the knowledge that he had witnessed another person's tenderness. Then, from somewhere in the back, he heard a sound that made his whole body still. The rattle of metal. Fast, systematic, and distinctly intentional. It could have been a key. It could have been a box opening. It could have been, he could not name, what it might be. Inside the room, the woman glanced toward a narrow corridor and a shadow moved in reply. The cat turned its head toward the sound and raised its ears. The man felt the air change. The unknown reached out with the tips of its fingers and touched the small pool of quiet he had made for himself. He pressed his palms flat on the brick and felt the cold seep through his sweater. He had crossed an invisible line between casual observer and implicated witness. He had followed because he was curious. He had come because he cared. Now he was on the cusp of a discovery he was not sure he wanted. The cat, restful in the woman's lap, rolled onto its back and exposed its belly like an invitation that implied trust. The woman laughed softly and began to trace the ribbon scab along the flank as if recounting a memory. Her fingers stilled. She looked toward the back corridor and called a name low and slow. A shadow moved and a figure stepped into the light. The figure was not a shadow at all. It was a boy, no more than 12, with a face smudged by the city, and hands that looked like they had learned to work early. He held something in his hand, a small object that glinted under the lamplight. The man's breath hitched. The object was a key, the exact silhouette drawn in the paper he had found. The boy's eyes darted toward the doorway where the man crouched, and for a tight second, their gazes locked. The boy's mouth formed an almost smile, as if at the absurdity of being watched by someone who had no claim to this secret life. The man stepped back without meaning to. His foot slipped on damp moss along the brick. A soft, wet sound, his shoe on moss, reverberated. Inside the room, the woman's head turned. The boy froze. The cat lifted its head and blinked slowly. In the doorway, the woman's expression shifted from contentment to curious attention. She started toward the door. The man's heart hammered in the small hollow of his ribs. He had crossed from being a neighbor to being an intruder. In one breath, he considered walking away and leaving the cat to her secret sanctuary, and in the next, he felt an impossible urge to step forward and ask everything. He stopped because He could not decide which of the two possible actions would be more honest: to leave and allow the shelter its secrecy, or to enter and risk exposing a fragile ecosystem to his clumsy human interference. Time folded thinly, and he made no movement. The woman crossed the room. Her fingers brushed the cat's back. She smiled at him, at the small crack in the door where he crouched, with a softness that suggested she might already know of him, or perhaps she did not look for permission at all. The boy held the key like a talisman. At that exact moment, as the rain tapped the courtyard and the cat looked between all the human faces, the building's old security light, one of those that rarely worked, flickered, and then, a loudest clunk. A door somewhere far off swung, open with such force the sound ricocheted against the brick, and from the alley beyond came the sharp barking of a dog and the metallic scream of a gate being latched. He flinched. The dog's bark made the cat jump and the woman frown. The boy turned, the key still in his hand, and the three of them moved like actors suddenly alerted to a shift in the scene. The man, from his place against the brick, felt the blood in his face flush. He could not move forward without being seen, and he could not retreat without leaving questions that might never be answered. He looked down at the paper in his pocket, "Meet me at midnight," and for the first time in weeks the small box beneath. His bed felt heavy with more than trinkets. It felt heavy with possibility. The cat lifted her head. She looked directly at the small crack where he hid, and then at the key in the boy's hand, and back at the woman. There was no panic in her gaze. There was an inscrutable currency of recognition. Then she rose, shook herself as if to cast off rain and tension, and walked toward the door that opened deeper into the sanctuary. The man wanted to follow. He wanted to know who had the enamel tag once. He wanted to understand the meaning of the ribbon and the washer. He wanted to know if she had been hurt elsewhere. He wanted to make sure this room was safe. He wanted, in the small way humans always do, to be part of the story that had been woven around this creature. He took one step forward, then another. The brick under his palms grew colder. The courtyard's silver light seemed to narrow its focus. The cat paused at the threshold, turned her head slowly, and fixed her gaze on him for a moment that stretched like thin glass. Her expression was ambiguous, part invitation, part reprimand. She lifted one paw and set it down. It was a movement. That could mean anything. Then, without warning, she darted across the courtyard like a drawn arrow and slipped through a narrow gate that led to the alley. The gate clanged behind her with an ordinary final sound. The boy held the key up as if to lock the gate behind her, and the woman followed. The man was left at the courtyard threshold, heart pounding, the paper in his pocket a burning thing. He had crossed an invisible border. He had seen a room of care. He had felt the tug of belonging. And now, as the last echo of the gate slid down the brick, he faced a choice. He could knock and demand entry. He could run up the stairs and wake Lena and ask for the story. He could wait in the dark and hope they would return. Or he could, most honest and most terrifying, go after them and discover what lay at the far end of the alley beyond the gate. He stepped forward, and then the alley swallowed him in a wet breath of night, and the air smelled of rain, keys, and the small, undeniable possibility that the cat had another life he was only beginning to understand. He ran. Not in the how-it-started way that becomes a story later, but in the small, immediate way of a man who has been given a thin thread and cannot help but follow it. The alley smelled of rain and old brick, and the city's small, stubborn rot. His shoes hit wet cobblestones with the kind of rhythm that makes your heart catch. There was a lamp at the far end that painted one strip of gold on the ground. Beyond it the night sat like a held breath. He kept the lamplight between him and the gate where she had slipped through. The gate's metal tasted of cold on his fingertips when his hand met it. He slipped past where the boy had stood, past the woman, past the thin door that led to the sanctuary, and the world narrowed to the cat's small, urgent silhouette. She moved like someone who had rehearsed this route many times. She threaded between trash bins and flowering weeds that had decided to be brave in the cracks. She paused once and looked back, the way someone looks backward when they want another person to be sure they are following. He saw the tiny wet print of her paw in the mud. He saw the thread of scar along her flank in the lamplight. He saw everything and wanted desperately to rearrange the world so there would be fewer scrapes and more safety. At the end of the alley, the city opened into something other, an old row of houses whose faces had the tired dignity of people who'd lived many lives. Their porches leaned like old men. Their windows were eyes with wrinkles. Lights were out, most of them. A few glowed like small, stubborn embers. He followed her to the one house whose porch swing still creaked when the wind brushed it. The paint was peeling in a pale, honest way. The door had been left slightly ajar, as if waiting for a visitor of a particular kind. He stopped at the gate of that porch and steadied his breath like a man about to open a book he'd been warned not to read. The cat had already slipped inside. She climbed the steps and paused at the threshold, looked back once, and then, as if encouraged by his presence, pushed the door. There was a smell that clung to the air, stewed apples, old lavender, an undertone of mothballs. It was the smell of houses that have kept their people for a long time. The light inside was thin and honeyed, like pages left in sunlight for years. Everything felt suspended. A kettle sat cold on the stove. A chair had a blanket draped over it as if someone might return and toss it casually over their shoulder. A knitting basket lay on the side table, forks of yarn splayed like a small domestic wildness. Photographs dotted the mantel, faces held in silver frames, smiles that were honest without being pretentious. He moved like a trespasser, not because he thought it would feel illegal, but because the house itself smelled of a privacy folded inward. On the table by the window lay a cup, half full of cold tea. Beside it, a small plate with a single biscuit that had been left untouched. He ran his thumb around the rim of the cup and felt a tiny crust of sugar. He found a coat, soft as if it had been worn daily. He breathed it in, and the breath hit something in his chest like a hand on a wound. There was an order to the house that said, "This is where someone lived with their life in place." He followed the cat as she padded through the room like a priestess, through a chapel. She went to a particular corner, to a small enclosed area by the back stair that was ringed with old newspapers and a patchwork of cushions. On the wall above, hung on a small nail, there was a collar, an old leather loop with an enamel tag. He froze. The tag had initials on it. He could read them now. They matched the letters he had half remembered from the one he'd found under the stairwell. They were the same sequence of letters, worn by weather and time. His stomach tightened, like a fist. On the mantel near a photograph, he saw her. The woman from the photograph was older, hair silver like a dawn. The photo showed her mid-laugh, head tipped back slightly, the kind of laugh that makes your eyes hurt a little to watch. She had the cat in her lap in that picture, exactly the same black cat, only younger, only less knotted by years. The cat's paw lay on the woman's wrist like a human hand placed with confidence. In the corner of the photograph there was handwriting on the white margin, "For M, my dearest companion." He sat down where the floor smelled like dust and time. Trembling hit him in sudden waves. His hands, he noticed this as if from a distance, were not steady. He had always thought the woman in his photograph belonged exclusively to his solitude. Now there was another archive being revealed in the curve of a mantelpiece and the softness of an old cardigan. A weathered notebook caught his eye. He opened it, pages thick with grocery lists, dates, times, simple things like rose water for the face, appointment with Dr. Hale, renewed license. But also there were lines written that trembled with an older grief. "If I go to the home, will she come with me? I cannot lift her. I will miss the way she listens to the kettle." The handwriting leaned with age like the house itself, falling in on itself sometimes, then straightening with a stubborn clarity. He read the lines a second time and felt his chest become an instrument struck by a new raw note. The woman had planned. She had worried. She had feared leaving the cat and had tried to orchestrate a route that would keep both of them whole. There were names listed, people who had agreed, perhaps provisionally, to take care. There was a line written that read, "If M will not come with me, please, whoever finds this, do not make her leave. Let her tell you where she wants to be." A silence built up like water behind a seal. He felt like someone standing at the edge of a river trying to decide whether to dive in. His throat felt raw. He could hear the cat's small purr now, the same purr that had once soothed him in the corner of his living room. She moved toward him and, with the casual authority of a creature who knows how to do the necessary emotional labor, climbed onto his knee. Her body was warm and heavy in the most precise way. For a second his breath hitched and his eyes blurred. He thought of the nights she had slept at his door. He thought of the paw print on his tile. He had imagined many stories. He had never guessed this exact shape. A house that waited empty, a woman who had planned to take her and then could not, a life folded into lists and careful notes. His hands were shaking. He picked up another photograph from the table, this one smaller, more private, and found it was a picture of the same woman by a window, knitting. In the bottom corner, a little date was written in a kind, crooked hand. The date was not so long ago. He realized with sudden, painful clarity that the timeline that had governed the cat's wandering was recent. The animal's roving had been forced upon her by changes that were human and stubborn and cruel in their ordinary way. He had a sudden, overwhelming image. The cat on that mat, sitting alone while the car that took her human pulled away. The idea made his breathing shallow. He imagined the woman leaning toward the small animal and whispering a promise. He imagined the cat waiting, not out of stubbornness, but out of a conviction that love could keep a place occupied. He could feel his throat tighten until he could no longer pretend composure. Trembling hands reached toward the cat's head. She responded by pressing the flat of her forehead into his palm. It was a small, incandescent motion. It hurt him forward, and then allowed him to breathe. Tears came, sudden and without ceremony. He had not intended to let them. He had, till then, thought of himself as a stoic person who did not require the mechanics of crying. The house's air, thick with the residue of another life, unbolted. Something? He began to read the notebook more carefully, tracing a path he had not known existed. There were notes about helping hands. There was a small square of paper taped inside with an address and a phone number. The handwriting that labeled, "It was angular," as if written by someone who was trying to be precise when emotions threatened to spill. On the same page was a sentence he could not bear at first. "If I go away, she will not leave the porch. She will wait until the last leaf drops." Understanding is a slow, domestic construction sometimes. He felt the full weight of it then. The cat had not been simply an animal wandering. She had been someone's companion, someone's daily architecture. She had gone to the places that remembered warmth and the cadence of a particular hand, the places that had been soft for her. He thought of the nights she had left and returned, of the way she had brought small gifts, as if attempting to barter. Now it clicked. The gifts were evidence of her trying to recreate crumbs of the home she had lost. The ribbon, the feather, the metal washer, tokens she hoped might stitch an invisible thread back to what had been. The enamel tag was a sign not of abandonment but of belonging. It had been cut loose. The woman's handwriting, the dates in the photographs, the kettle, the plate. These were proof that someone had tried and failed to keep her inside the human world that made sense. He rocked slightly on the floor until the cat nosed the corner of his mouth and the underside of his jaw. The touch was small, a punctuation of trust. He smelled lavender on her fur as if someone had loved her when they left. He let himself feel the heat of that evidence and the chill of the house at once. He realized that the cat had been waiting for the return of a human who could not come back. She refused to give up on the idea of home. A sound from the back stair made him look up. Lena's voice called softly, then the boys' cautious steps. They climbed the porch and pushed open the door. Lena's face creased when she saw the photographs. She stepped inside and put her palm against the leather collar, feeling the chipped enamel. Her eyes filled. The boy stood beside her like someone who had been given instructions on how to feel and was consulting them with care. "It was her," Lena said, voice small. She knelt, and the cat walked to her, and for a moment the three of them, the man who had followed, the woman who had cared, and the cat who had been courier of a wandering life, were a small constellation around a coffee table. The boy held the key like a promise. Lena told a story, bits of it falling like confetti. The woman on the mantel, M, had lived here alone. Her husband had gone some years back. She had loved the cat more than she expected, and more than she believed herself capable. The neighbors had helped when M became ill. They arranged with the best of intentions for her to go to a care home. There was a day when the house was emptied a little, then entirely. According to Lena, there had been mistakes. Phone numbers missed, a misunderstanding at the council, a day when the van left and the cat did not go out the window they thought she had. She waited. She waited on that porch like a prayer. Some people saw her there and assumed she belonged to another house. Others left a dish. But nobody cleared the misunderstanding because the bureaucracy of small cities is a maze that can let a living thing fall through and not notice. Lena's voice, caught when she said she wouldn't leave. She waited. The boy, who had been feeding the cat scraps for a while, added, "I used to see her at the window. She would paw when it rained. She'd wait until the light spilled in. When I found the key, I asked Emma's neighbor about it, and he said, 'Oh, she left, took the last bus. We thought maybe she'd come back. We thought maybe the cat would go join her. But she stayed.'" The man felt the room tilt. He had all along thought the cat might have been simply stray and free and uninterested in a particular person. He had been wrong in ways that were tender and heart-aching. The cat had been waiting at thresholds for someone who no longer could cross them. She had refused to give up on the idea that the human who had made soft rounds in that kitchen might return and remember her. That refusal was not stubbornness without grace. It was a devotion, maybe the purest kind, that made small sacrifices and kept vigil. He put his hand on the little cat's head. She pressed into his palm like an anchor. He saw himself then unmistakably. This is how people come back from being hollowed out, not by grand rescues, but by small acts of bearing witness. The cat had been telling him without language that her life had been interrupted in a way that required repair. She had been asking for a place to stay where the memory of hands on kettles and laughter by the window could still exist. His chest felt tight. He tasted iron and tears. He had to steady himself on the coffee table because his knees felt sudden and raw. He paced a small circle around the room like someone who needed to find a step to climb. He thought of calling the council. He thought of knocking on doors and waking administrative systems into action. He thought of finding M, if she still lived somewhere, and telling her that her companion had waited. He thought of all the bureaucracy and human error that had allowed an old woman and her cat to be separated. Have you ever followed an animal somewhere not knowing why? He had never meant to ask a stranger that, but Lena had asked him in a voice that had the quality of someone looking for human connection. The question hung there like a small hope. He answered in a way that was not a sentence but an agreement. Yes. He said it to the room, to the house, to the photograph. They decided to find out. Not because they needed to be heroic. Not because they wanted a story. Because to leave the scene alone would be to participate in the forgetfulness that had already done enough harm. Lena dialed numbers. The boy went to the window to check the street. The man called a clinic number listed in the notebook. Each small action felt brittle and vital. They were doing the work that cities often leave undone, the work of attending. An hour later, with the rain lightening and the house huddled around them like a secret, a nurse arrived. She had a badge and kind hands and a memory that could be coaxed with a name. They gave her the name from the notebook. She hesitated, then smiled. A smile like someone who thinks she might be in the middle of arranging a small miracle. The nurse made calls. The man watched her fingers spell the name into a phone as if activating the past. She grew quiet, then rose, saying, "She's in the care home 3 blocks from here. She's here for observation. They thought she'd have family." She inhaled as if the next sentence mattered. They didn't know the cat had stayed. Her eyes met the man's. He felt an odd sense of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He imagined the woman in the care home, hair combed, hands folded in her lap, eyes that might have been disappointed, and then, perhaps, still anchored to, the photograph on her mantel. They packed a small bag of things, blanket, the collar, the photographs. The cat brushed against Lena's calf, then gave the man a soft, provisional look, as if to say she approved of their plan. He cupped the enamel tag in his palm like something precious. It was cooler now that it had been inside the house. The boy's fingers closed around the key with a gravity that suggested he felt the story's weight. At the care home, the hall smelled of lemon cleaner and the sort of paper cups hospitals use because they are practical. The woman sitting by a window looked smaller than she had in the photographs. Age had softened the edges of her face into something smaller and more vulnerable. Yet when she looked up and the cat, untamed and old, was carried into the room, the expression on her face folded into something that made the man's breath stop. She did not leap up as if in youth. She reached slowly, like a person cupping a flame not to scorch it but to feel its warmth. She called the cat's name in a voice that trembled in the places grief makes thin. Marmalade? The cat's head turned. The name was wrong, but tender. The woman's hands, uncertain, found the cat and pressed her to her chest. The cat tucked her head under the woman's chin and began to purr with a sound that was old and steady, as if it had been storing a day's worth of motor inside. The year's tears came then, not just from him. Lena wiped her eyes. The boy put his hand on the woman's shoulder without speaking. The nurse sat down and exhaled, like someone who had been permitted to witness something sacred. The woman's lips moved. They formed a name, barely audible, then a laugh that broke into a sob. It was not dramatic. It was simple and human. "Oh, my love," she said to the cat and to the room, and the syllables were like a small prayer completed. The man's hands trembled. He looked at the woman's fingers as they stroked the cat's back. He saw the decades between the photos and the room, small as they were. He saw the small domesticities that make up a life. Morning tea, knitting, a radio left on low. He felt, then, what the cat had been holding for him without words, that sometimes animals are the last pneumatic system for a human's memory. They keep the shape of gestures when people are phased out by illness or moved by institutions. They cling to the human habit of repetition, and in that repetition they become living memorials. The woman, M, looked at him then with eyes that had the glaze of days, but behind it was a fierce clarity. "Thank you," she whispered. The cat pressed her head into M's palm, then into his. Then she lifted her head and with a decision that made the room hush, turned and walked to the man. She sat at his feet and wept, a small, absurd, grateful sound, and then curled against his shoe like a coin finally found a pocket. He stood there, hands empty, and let the small miracle of belonging rest in his chest. He was not a hero. He was a man who had followed a cat and discovered an obligation he had not known he carried. He had found a history that was tender and messy. He had found an old woman who had been left in the architecture of modern care, and a cat who had refused to give up on the habitual scaffolding of being. He realized, with the ache and the release, of someone who had been given a truth that the cat had been telling him all along, without words or drama, that she needed a place to belong. Not because she demanded it with a starving mouth, but because she had been trying to preserve the memory of a life that once included a hand that reached for her, a kettle that whistled, and a woman who laughed. The realization hit him like a hand on the back. The cat had been waiting for someone who would return and take her back. Where that person could not return, she had waited anyway. She had refused to believe that home was a finite thing that people could simply take away. Her persistence had been a lesson in loyalty and in hope, stubborn in the way that only the old and the faithful can be. Trembling hands, silent tears. The woman's fingers found his knuckles and squeezed. "You followed her," she said. There was gratitude in the words, but also a question like an afterthought. Why? He did not have a tidy answer. He could only gesture toward the cat, to the house, to the photographs on the mantel, and say, "She waited at my door too." They arranged for M to have visits. They arranged for the cat to have a schedule. The boy, who had been feeding the cat out of scraps and pocket coins, was given a small job to come by and help bring food. Lena asked if she could tidy the house. The man who had once kept his life tightly folded found himself staying longer than he thought he might in the care home's small visiting room, He watched the cat, no longer merely a creature at his threshold, circle the woman's knees like an anchor, then cross the room and plop down against his shoe as if to say, "This is also for you." The moment of understanding remained with him. The cat had been a quiet teacher. She had shown him that some beings refuse the erasure of memory. That refusal is its own kind of demand, not for punishment but for recognition. She had told him that love can be the thing that keeps a place, occupied in someone's mind and heart, even after the person has gone somewhere else, that the duty of those who notice is to respond. He left the care home with a band of people, Lena, the boy, the nurse, walking with him down the street. The apartment's porch swing creaked in the wind. The city smelled of rain and something, washed anew. On the way back, he folded his scarf tighter and felt the cat's small presence like a warmth at the back of his mind. At home, the rug at his door was still a kind of altar, one that had been tended by a small, patient creature. The mat would continue to hold memories and paw prints. The man understood now what she had been trying to show him the entire time. She wanted a place to belong, and she had been refusing to be written out of a story that had once been hers. She had refused to give up. Her refusal had been a kind of steady prayer. He sat on the edge of his sofa that night with his hands folded. The cat jumped up and circled his legs before settling on the armrest and peering at him with the veteran's clear honesty of an animal who has known hardship. She pressed her head into his palm, and he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. The contact was a small, electric thing. He could feel his breath match the hush of her purr. In that close, warm hush, understanding unfurled. The cat had been waiting for the return of a human who could not come, but she had not given up. She had chosen instead to map her own network of kindness. Neighbors who left bowls, a boy who fed her scraps, a woman who opened her door with a laugh. And through that map she stitched an improbable community. She had been asking not for rescue in the way the world imagines rescue, but for recognition. She had been asking for someone to notice the house she loved, and the man had finally noticed. He breathed. The air in his apartment felt softer. The lamp threw a small circle on the page of a book he had not finished. Outside, the city moved, on indifferent and kind in small measures. Inside, he held the cat on his lap like a small proof that attention matters. He understood then that care is a daily architecture. Bowls filled, collars checked, visits made, names remembered. The cat lifted her head and looked at him with an expression that had been there since the first time she'd slept at his door. Not a demand, but a soft invitation. He answered by running his hand along the curve of her spine. His fingers found the scab by her flank and traced it gently, as if honoring the wound that had been earned by waiting. He thought, not yet of adoption, or the legalities of becoming a guardian, but of the simple fact that he would not leave her at a threshold again. The thought settled into him like a small flame. He did not know how the future would look. He only knew that the cat had refused to give up on the life she had shared with someone who had left, and in that steadfastness, she had taught him how to keep a vigil of his own for the people and beasts that the world tends to forget. At the end of the night, she curled against his chest, the same way she had once curled near the doorway at the building lobby. He felt the soft rise and fall of her breathing and the steady hiss of an old radiator. He wept quietly, not loud, not performative, but the sound of someone who has seen a small truth and can no longer keep it folded. He had followed her into a story he had not known he needed to be part of, and the arc of that story had brought him to something both awful and luminous, a human life interrupted, and the refusal of an animal to let that life be erased. The cat turned her face up and licked his knuckle. Her eyes, those glossy, knowing beans, met his. There was a clarity in them that felt like a small benediction. For the first time since she had arrived on his mat, the man felt wholly seen by another living thing in a way that made the edges of his own loneliness shift. He understood finally, and with the recoil of a bell struck, what she had been trying to tell him all along, that love survives neglect, that waiting is a kind of prayer, and that some beings, even when left behind, will not surrender the small rituals that keep a life intact. He bent to press his forehead against hers. Her purr rose like a small engine. He let the tears come. He had found out what had been true beneath the gifts and the vanishing and the enamel tag. He had found the shape of an abandoned life, and how stubbornly shape held when memory is honored. The understanding settled into him like a seed planted in good soil. He did not know what he would do tomorrow, or the next week, or how many steps would be necessary to keep both Em and her cat anchored to the life they ought to have. But he knew now the work that mattered: presence, attendance, the daily rituals of bowls and names and visits. The cat lay on his lap, fold by fold of fur, and the man felt his heart open to the possibility of a small, steady joy. It was, he realized, the most urgent kind of truth. They settled into a new rhythm, not at once, not like a scene that snaps into place. The world is rarely that kind. It rearranged itself in small increments, like furniture being nudged until it fits the room. There were mornings that felt exactly the same as they had before. The radiator's small sigh, the neighbor's kettle clinking through the wall, the slow march of light across the windowsill. And there were mornings that felt different in a way that mattered only to the heart. The cat stayed often. She did not become a carved fixture. She remained in many ways herself, an old animal who kept her secrets and her routes. She accepted the man's couch and his armchair with a cautious generosity, and she accepted Lena's house and the boys' stray scraps with the same impartiality. She belonged to the porous community that had formed around her, a network of hands that together made a life possible. That network, stitched in the quiet labor of people who noticed, became the real rescue. Em improved in small increments. Not in the cinematic way some stories promise, a miraculous recovery that sweeps clean the clutter of long months. Instead, she grew steadier by small measures. There were good days. There were days that were fogged and thin. The care home arranged regular visits from a visiting nurse, and Lena came by like clockwork, with bags of groceries and soup warmed in a thermos. The man made himself part of the schedule. He would go to the care home on Thursdays and sit near the window. He would hold Em's hand as she told him stories in fragments. Some names came back full. Others arrived like ghosts that hesitated at the door. The cat's presence at the care home changed things. People noticed it first as a curiosity. Then they noticed it as a comfort. She padded through the halls with the same air she'd carried, along the building's landing, quiet, decisive. She chose Em's lap as if it were always meant to be hers, and she chose to come to the man's shoes when she wanted a different kind of attention. The residents watched, sometimes from the curtains of their rooms, sometimes from the sunlit common area. A woman who had not moved from the home in months laughed when the cat batted at the fringe of a knitted blanket. A nurse who had seen the machinery of the institution grind through lives with bureaucratic efficiency put her hand once on the cat's flank and let herself say softly, "She is precious." Back at the man's apartment, the rug at the door was no longer a place of waiting for a single presence. It bore the impression of several lives. The cat left paw prints in steady patterns that the man learned by heart. He bought a small tin for the gifts she sometimes brought, the feathers, the ribbons, the little scraps of evidence of her wandering. He placed the tin on the bookshelf, and when his mornings were too gray, he would open it and let his fingers find a ribbon and feel the memory like a tiny pulse. Time did what it always does, it softened edges. The man's grief did not vanish. It folded into the fabric of daily life and became, oddly, more bearable. He came to see that grief and gratitude could exist beside each other without canceling one another out. The photograph of the woman he had kept in the living room kept its place on the mantel, and the cat sometimes slept there as if guarding the memory. He began, without planning it, to bring small things to the care home: cups of tea, a magazine with crossword puzzles, a small jar of jam Em liked. The acts were modest. They were not sufficient to erase the cruelty of whatever had dislodged Em from her house. But they were necessary. They were attention, and attention accumulates. The arrangement they made for the cat evolved into something practical and humane. Em could not live alone in the house yet. The council discussed options. Lena and the neighbors pitched in. The Boy and the nurse volunteered to check on the house when he could not. For now, the cat split her time. She would wake some mornings at M's side and others on the man's armchair. On Sundays, she would visit Lena's kitchen and hop up to the windowsill where the radio played soft music. Rules were fluid. People negotiated with kindness. The cat, Marm, the name still odd and soft on their tongues, moved through it all as if she had never belonged to one thing only. The months that followed had their own small catalog of scenes. There was the day the man took Marm to the vet and discovered the scrapes along her flank were healing, but that she had an old ache in her hips that made stairs difficult. The vet recommended a small supplement and a padded bed. The man bought a bed with an awkward online form and watched the cat evaluate it with aristocratic disdain before settling in as if to say, "Yes, this will do." There was the afternoon Lena brought a box of yarns and knit a small blanket for the cat in colors that looked like sunrise. There was a week the boy spent filling in for the man at the care home when he had a cold. The small reciprocities of those traded favors hummed like a low current through the neighborhood. An unexpected, quiet thing happened halfway through the next winter. Em had a day of clear memory. She sat at the window, measured the light on, her hands, and then asked, by name, about a person who had not been in her life for years. The man, who had sat with her so many Thursdays he had the cadence of her breathing mapped into his own, told her about a small domestic thing, how Marm had begun to sleep at his door, and then moved deeper into their shared orbit. Em's face softened in a way that was more luminous than any photograph. She smiled a smile that mended something in him that had been brittle. "She never left," Em said, as if telling a fact. "She was waiting. She knows me." The boy who had found the key took a small job that allowed him to help not only the cat, but a handful of other animals in a neighborhood that sometimes found its resources thin. The neighbors began to rotate small chores. Someone mowed a lawn that had encroached around the old house. Someone repaired a broken latch. The man learned the art of small diplomacy, how to suggest help without making others feel indebted, how to offer his time and then, when appropriate, to step back. He found that the place where kindness happens is rarely dramatic. It is the slow, monotonous accumulation of things done, and then amid the ordinary cadence of bowls and visits and patched knees, there was a gift. Not a grand thing, not a miraculous rewrite of history, something more private. It came in a package the man did not expect. He had been staying late in the care home one afternoon because Em had asked him to bring a book and read aloud, something from a pocket anthology of short poems. He read without great flourish, letting the act be more a companionable sound than a performance. After he read, Em closed the book, looked at him, and handed him a small folded paper. Her hands were careful. The paper was old and the creases had softened into memory. He accepted it with a hand that felt clumsy. Inside was a single line of handwriting and a tiny pressed violet. The line read, "For the man who made the rug a place no longer empty." He had not expected it. The small verb, made, felt like an assessment that reached him beneath the skin. It was not a certificate or a legal document. It was not meant to free him from anything. It was a recognition. He felt his throat throb. He said in a voice that was smaller than he felt, "I didn't do it alone." Em smiled. Her eyes were bright and unexpectedly fierce. "No," she said. "You didn't. You helped her wait." That was the job. Then she coughed lightly and added, as if revealing a patch of mischief, "Take good care of her. She chooses well." What the folded paper did for him was more profound than the words. It acted like a mirror, a small object that confirmed a truth he had started to suspect. Being the person who notices and acts matters. It is sometimes the only thing that prevents lives from being erased by absent paperwork, by inattentive systems, by the simple cruelty of disconnection. There was a more material gift later. A few months on, the neighborhood organized a small gathering on a late afternoon when the air had that hint of spring. People brought tea, and someone baked a cake the size of a small kindness Lena hosted on her stoop. The boy set up a table and the man brought Marm, who accepted the attention with the graciousness of someone who knows her value. They spoke softly about things that mattered: who could check on the house during vacations, who would drive Em to the clinic, which neighbor would sew a new patch into a blanket. In the middle of this, the superintendent, who had a weathered face like a map and a voice like gravel, tapped the table with a spoon. He had gone to the council and pushed for a small practical thing, a letter confirming a neighborly duty of care. It was not official guardianship. It was a formal acknowledgement that a group of neighbors would be responsible for the house's upkeep and for ensuring Em's companion would have a safe place to return. The piece of paper was small and bureaucratic and also big in the only way that counts. It created accountability. There was a soft cheer. The cat, unbothered by the human fanfare, walked in a neat line through the crowd and leapt into the man's lap, curling there like sunlight. The days folded into months. They learned one another's limits and rhythms. The man learned not to assume he could always be present. He learned to train his attention to be steady when he was near and flexible when he was not. The cat's mobility meant she could choose the contours of her life. That choice, simple and radical, was an ethical point they all tried to honor. For Marm, it was not a compromise. It was a full life. A house with a mantel, a thrifted bed in a small apartment, the boys' scraps, Lena's laughter, Em's hands. For the man, it was a miraculous rearrangement. Someone who came when he called, not with demand but with company. There were, of course, difficulties. The care home had rules. The council had forms. The house had repair bills. There were neighbors who disagreed over petty things. There were times when bureaucratic delays made the man feel the old, thin ache of helplessness. On a particular evening, a contractor missed a scheduled visit and the house's old boiler threatened to fail as the weather leaned into storm. The man and Lena and the boy rallied. Phone calls, pooled funds, the superintendent's gruff competence. They fixed what they could. The cat sat in the doorway and watched the humans scurrying like someone who permits chaos to exist within an order that will, ultimately, correct itself. And the final gift, the one the story keeps like a small talisman, arrived in a way that made them all catch their breath. It was neither the kind of thing you could have planned for nor a random stroke of luck. It felt like the perfect alignment of small acts. One spring morning early, when the air had the brittle sweetness of a newly opened window, Marm padded into the man's apartment and placed something on the rug with the exact deliberation she had always shown. It was not a toy, not a ribbon, not a feather. It was a small envelope sealed with a smear of dried glue and a faded sticker where once a child's hand had pressed a star. He opened it with a finger that trembled a little. Inside was a photograph. It was small and creased at the corner, like things that had been handled and loved. In the photo, Em was younger. She stood at the doorway of the man's building, smiling the same way she did in the mantel photograph. And the cat was at her feet, mid-step, looking like a shadow with the sun behind it. On the back of the photograph, in the woman's handwriting, there was a single sentence: "For when you forget what you did for me." The man read it and felt the words anchor themselves in his chest. He had not realized he would ever need a proof that what he had done mattered. The photograph became a talisman. He placed it on the mantel the way one places a prayer. Sometimes he would look at it and remember how small the acts had been and how enormous their accumulation had been. The cat, the real protagonist in all of this, continued to do what she had always done. She refused to be sentimental. She refused to obey the human proclivity for claiming ownership. She chose. She came and went. She slept on the armchair, and then on Lena's windowsill. She stepped into the care home and made the residents laugh. She accepted the man's hand when he offered it, and she made space on the rug where the warmth of bodies had once been a thing to grieve. She had been, all along, an insistence on continuity. If love is a verb, she performed it in a way that seemed humble but was in truth commanding, by being there. In the end, the final gift of the story was both small and grand. The small part: a photograph, a handwritten sentence, a neighborly letter of duty, a knitted blanket, a vet visit that eased pain. The grand part: a community that learned to notice and then to act. The man understood then that rescue is never purely the work of single persons. It is the product of a society that sometimes unexpectedly remembers how to be human. People had shown up in practical ways. The superintendent's conversation with the council, Lena's tea and steady presence, the boy's tireless errands, the vet's gentle care, M's small, fierce instructions. Together, these acts created a scaffolding that carried two lives forward. There is a particular tenderness in knowing you were needed. The man found that tenderness unusual and electric. He had sheltered himself in the neat boxes of solitude. For so long he had forgotten how porous a life could be. He had feared being drawn back into the messy, sticky stuff of relationships. He had discovered that being part of a life, even a life that includes the caretaking of an old cat, returns more than it asks for. The returns are small and not always visible. They are a cup of soup that warms a hand. They are the quiet of an afternoon when the cat's breathing is a slow, small engine. They are a photograph on a mantle that tells you plainly that a thing you did had consequence. Months folded into seasons and then into another year. The man's apartment felt fuller, not just with objects but with meanings. The cat's paws traced new paths over the rug. M had a schedule of visits. The neighbors had a system. The boy's small job turned into a meaningful routine that gave him a sense of purpose. Lena became not only a friend but a partner in the kind of domestic politics that matter. Who checked on the house? Who would carry M to her appointments? Who would open a window when the day was too close and heavy? Every so often the man would catch the cat looking at him with an expression that was almost human. It was not a calculation. It was recognition. Once, after a heavy day at the care home, when the man had been given news about paperwork delays that might prevent a permanent solution for M, he came home feeling smaller than usual. The cat greeted him with a small headbutt, and then walked over to his shoes and placed the tiny, creased photograph from earlier on his toes. She did it without fanfare. It felt like a benediction. He laughed in spite of himself. The laugh solved nothing, but it altered the shape of the day. What remained at the close of this story is not grandeur. It is not tidy closure. It is, instead, a deepened sense of possibility. The world is made kind by gestures that are ordinary and repeated. They do not fix everything. They make a place where people and animals can persist. The man learned this with the sort of slow gratitude that never needs loud declaration. He learned it in the cat's patient insistence, in M's trembling thanks, in Lena's steady hands, in the boy's small earnest work. One evening, toward the end of a long, bright day, the man sat on his sofa and watched Marm sleep. The light spilled across her black fur like a smear of gold. He ran his thumb along the soft ridge above her shoulder. Outside, the city hummed in a way that felt ordinary and blessing at the same time. He thought of all the small things that had to happen for her to be where she was. A mislaid phone number, a boy's curiosity, a woman's stubborn laughter, a superintendent's small advocacy, a vet's kindness, a neighbor's bowl. He thought of the photograph in his hand and the way M had written a sentence just for him. He realized then that the final gift, the one that mattered above all, wasn't an object at all. It was a rearrangement of attention. It was the way they had learned to notice. It was the discipline of showing up. Gifts were the tangible artifacts that told the story, but the deep gift, the one that would outlast the tin and the photograph and the letters, was a community that had practiced care. There are endings people expect in stories like this. The cat adopted formally. The woman returned home and lived out a long life in that house. The man remarried and the building became a portrait of domestic contentment. Those are pleasant endings. They are tidy. They are also not always true to the messy, beautiful reality of life. This one offers something more honest. An ongoing membership in the small order of people who choose to be present. Years from that first paw print on the tile, the man would sit with a younger neighbor on the landing and tell a version of what had happened. He would give them the photograph to hold. He would show them the tin of the cat's gifts. He would tell them plainly that what had mattered was the willingness to notice and to act. The younger neighbor would ask a practical question, and the man would shrug and say, Start with one small thing. Put out a bowl, knock on a door, bring a cup of tea. Keep the letter in your pocket. Notice. It sounds small. It is small. It changes the world. The cat would, until her last days, still choose. She would still wander to Lena's, still curl in M's lap at the care home, still return to the man's armchair for a nap in the thin afternoon sun. She would continue to bring small gifts. Once, toward the end, she placed a small worn button on his windowsill. He kept it in the tin, with the photographs. It was impossibly plain. He cherished it like a relic. When the time came that the cat's purr slowed and the steps became more careful, the neighborhood rallied as gently as it could. The vet came with calm hands. Lena and the boy and Em and the man formed a quiet ring around her. They spoke in low voices and held her in turns. They read poems and silly lines from the corner of a joke book. They held her until her breathing eased and then stopped, and in that small private room, they gave thanks to a life lived not grandly but closely. Grief returned then. It came like rain. He let it. He honored it. He placed the photograph on the mantle and then took the photograph down many times. He found that the loss was not a negation of what had been, but an enlargement of what had been given. He could say with some steadiness that he had been part of a life story, and that he had not let it be swallowed by the indifferent rhythms of a busy city. He had noticed. He had acted. On the day they buried the cat's collar in a small patch of earth behind the rose bush in the courtyard, people came. Not all of them had known the cat well. Some had only seen her in the doorway or fed her a scrap. They stood in a loose circle and spoke of small things that mattered. The way she had taught them to look up from their phones. The way she had made a routine into a ritual. The way she had somehow coaxed an entire building into a gentler, more watchful mode. Em placed one hand on the small mound of earth. She whispered a memory and then leaned back and let the people around her become the testimony. The final gift, the one that lingered after grief, was this. The man learned that attention makes worlds. He learned that when one person notices a thing and decides to act, it ripples. Lives that might be frayed stitch back, not always the same, but in ways that allow for warmth. He learned that rescue does not always look like a headline. Sometimes rescue is quiet. Sometimes rescue is a rug that no longer has prints of absence, but a palimpsest of presence. He carried that lesson forward. He watched more. He acted more. He kept the photograph in his pocket on certain days, and would look at it when the apartment threatened to become too small. He would sometimes press the paper to his mouth as if kissing a cheek. He would remember the cat's heavy purr and M's small thank you and the boy's key, and Lena's laughter and all the small hands that had held a life together. There is a universal truth in the arc of such a story. It is not that every lonely thing will be saved. It is not that every broken system can be mended with one effort. The truth is quieter and more stubborn. That love, however small, is practice. That trust, when given patiently, can pull someone out of the gray edge of being left behind. That second chances are not dramatic but are built in the tiny acts of being present, again and again. He would remember, always, the simple miracle that an old black cat, with a nicked ear and a slow motor, could gather a neighborhood and stitch them into a life that was richer for their attention. He would say, later at the window on quiet nights, that the world needs more people who will do the unremarkable work of kindness. The work is not unremarkable in its consequences. It is, in fact, the way entire lives find their bearings again. The man kept a small card in his wallet. On it he had written, in hurried, uneven script, the sentence M had given him, for the man who made the rug a place no longer empty. He would show it sometimes to those who asked why he had stayed. It reminded me, he would say, that small things matter, that paying attention is sacred. When people asked him what the cat had taught him, he would answer in a voice that pleased him for its honesty. She taught me that waiting is not the same as giving up, he would say. She taught me that love can be quiet, and that it can be stubborn, and that sometimes the only thing a person needs is someone to show up. He would smile after the sentence and feel, inside the smile, the exact shape of that lesson, and in the after of the cat's life, the soft. Careful after that comes when grief loosens and memories begin to bloom instead of ache. The man continued to walk the halls and the courtyards and to notice. He poured tea for neighbors. He fixed latches. He read books aloud at the care home when Em asked for it. He missed the cat with an ache that sat in his chest like a small stone, and he held that ache with the same tenderness with which he had held the animal in his lap. That perhaps is the final gift too. Not the thing given to you, but the thing you become when you have given attention away faithfully. The man became someone who could be trusted to notice. The neighborhood became a little softer. Em had, in the end, the warmth of being remembered. The cat, who had refused to give up, had taught them all a way of being that mattered more than a tidy rescue story. It was a way of living that said, show up, notice, act. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.